Now, the next discussion is quite a special one. I had the privilege of interviewing Erik Voorhees last year. It was actually an incredibly emotional discussion about decentralization. We call him the thoughtful OG decentralist. And since then, his talks about decentralization have received standing ovations. It really is quite an extraordinary thing. He is the founder of ShapeShift, a self-custody crypto interface which decentralized into an open source DAO in 2021. And a fun fact, you've heard of the saying, don't run before you can walk. Well, in fact, he was skiing at the age of 10 months before he was walking. And here to interview him is Bill Tai. Please welcome them both back to the stage.
All right, this will be fun, yeah. So I've been, we've been hearing each other's names for literally, a decade, and hadn't actually had a chance to have a real conversation until very recently. Yeah. Fascinating stuff that you've worked on. Yeah. So again, look at your app. Ask questions through the app if you like. Some of his background is in the app in the list of attendees. I'm presuming that everybody is here in part because they do believe in self-sovereignty and kind of control over your own assets and decentralization. You've been a pioneer in this space, obviously, for the entire ride, and you in a couple of different startups, I guess, built a centralized thing that I don't know if it got decentralized or not, the first one. And then the second, I don't know if you can talk about it, but the second one, ShapeShift, I think everybody knows, because I think all of the early people use ShapeShift. He also had an application that I think, what year was it, your DICE thing?
What, 2012.
Okay, 2012, and it became the single highest volume transaction place for Bitcoins.
Yeah, half of all the transactions.
Yeah, 50% of all Bitcoin transactions, just mind-boggling. Anyway, but so you kind of moved on from that and then started ShapeShift. And then I think you had an incredible journey with that because you actually took that into a decentralized governance structure. So I'd love to hear your stories about how'd you think about that? Why'd you do it? What are some of the lessons learned in that period?
Yeah, okay. So, yeah, ShapeShift started as an exchange, basically, for digital assets. You would trade a Bitcoin for an Ethereum, or I guess when we launched, Ethereum didn't exist yet, but you would trade it for a Litecoin or whatever. And we really built that to be like a protection from people against things like Mt. Gox. So for those of you who don't know, Mt. Gox was like 99% of all the Bitcoin trading activity in the early years. And through a combination of malfeasance and hackings, they lost $400 million, which was like a huge portion of the entire industry's money back then. And so we built ShapeShift to basically protect users. And we would do that in two ways. One, we wouldn't hold their funds. And two is we wouldn't take their personal information because we didn't need it or want it. And so we grew rapidly with that model. By the time the 2017 crypto bubble happened, we were on the radars of all the regulators in several jurisdictions. And they didn't, for whatever reason, didn't even thank us for building something that would protect users. I thought that that's what they would care about. Instead, they were very upset that we would not spy on all these people and report them all to the government. Personally, I have an ethical problem with taking innocent people's information and giving it to a government when they haven't even been accused of a crime. So this put us in the crosshairs with the government, and we had a serious tension between the permissionless ideals of cryptocurrency, which is that any human, if they're following these specific rules of mathematics, can transact with each other, and us as a centralized corporation that had to follow various jurisdictions and regulations. These things were at odds, and every crypto company that exists faces this dilemma. I went through a period of a couple very dark years trying to navigate through that, and ultimately I said, I'm not playing this game anymore. I'm not going to be deputized by the government for their purposes. And so we decentralized ShapeShift. We turned it into an open source software project. We paid out all of our investors and our employees with our own funds, and the thing lives on as a decentralized project. So I've been semi-retired for 2 years, and that's the short version of the story.
Any regrets on how you did it, and or things that you would do differently, or newer things that you would add to the mix when you were doing it last time, given what you've learned since?
Yeah, I think a lot of people struggle with the idea that a DAO, they think DAOs are like this kind of egalitarian thing where everyone's equal and there's no hierarchies of any kind. And this is, of course, not true. Like, humans require hierarchies and they require structure. But I think if we could have communicated earlier on that, like, there will be structure to how these departments of the DAO operate, and there will be leaders, and those leaders have control over these departments, and to have just been a little more affirmative with those kind of communications, that would have gone better. Because once we opened it up to the community, there were certainly a lot of people that came in and they were like, oh, well, why don't I have all the authority that everyone else does? So that was a little thing, but in large part, the governance has worked. Yeah. That's
amazing. Yeah, I mean, I guess democracy is chaos in some ways, right? So, yeah, that would be a hard thing to corral, but yeah, communication means a lot. Yeah, and then some of the stuff you talked about with Erik last year, are things in crypto really decentralized? Because I think you have some strong opinions, or maybe you expressed some opinions last year, because you look at things like DEXs or miners, or are there groups that have de facto control, or is it headed in the right direction? Is it not in the right direction?
I think this requires some nuanced analysis, right? So in the cryptocurrency world, for the first time, we have the ability to be decentralized. And a lot of projects call themselves decentralized just because they're cryptocurrency. And the simple...
Yeah, so let's define. So get to level set, what is decentralization?
Yeah, so decentralization, especially in the cryptocurrency context, is no single actor controlling it. An actor here can mean a single company, a single cohort of people that know each other, no specific jurisdiction or government being in charge of it. Basically, any single point of failure, if that exists, is a cut against a claim to be decentralized.
Okay.
And the mistake people make is to think of these in binary terms, where they think, okay, either something is centralized or it's decentralized, and they argue about what it is. In reality, like with many things, it's a gradient, and it's a multivariate gradient. So when you're looking at a cryptocurrency project, you can assess the degree to which it's decentralized in multiple areas, right? Is it a blockchain? Is the blockchain itself decentralized? Are the nodes decentralized? Maybe they are, but maybe like 3 people control the entire code repo. So is that a decentralized project or not, right? Like that's an interesting thing to talk about. So whoever's in this industry really needs to like think in these terms of, to what degree is something decentralized? Why should it be? Not everything should be decentralized. You know, it has trade-offs when you do that. So, but just thinking a little more richly and nuanced, I think, is my advice there.
So you're describing basically a taxonomy, kind of like in the computer networking world. There's this like OSI networking layer thing. I don't know if you've seen that, but so I guess you're describing kind of the blockchain itself, the governance of the blockchain. How many layers do you look when you look at, is something decentralized? You described it already, so maybe you're going to make you repeat yourself. But what are the things you're looking at? In what order?
It depends on the project you're looking at, right?
Okay.
If you're comparing a DApp, a decentralized application, that's going to have a different set of parameters than a base layer blockchain. So you can't even really compare these things perfectly. Really, you just have to spend time looking at it, and you have to understand, like, what are the variables, which ones should be decentralized, which ones shouldn't. And then to make matters more complicated, of course, these things aren't static. So whatever the rating is for decentralization on a certain vector, that will change over time, right? Bitcoin is more decentralized today than it was when it started. You could say that, like, when Satoshi mined the Genesis block, it was a perfectly centralized project, right? There was literally one guy that controlled all the Bitcoin and all the software. And from that genesis of perfect centralization, it successfully decentralized over time. And that happens. Some projects start off decentralized, and then through various reasons, they start coagulating and you start getting centralization of power. So it's like a constantly moving, flowing thing that you have to be careful about.
Interesting. Let's see. Was there a question?
Yes, are we there yet?
Oh, Yeah, Stacy, that's a good question.
Are we there yet? That's that binary thinking that I'm trying to dissuade us from doing, right? This is a destination, or this is not a destination, it's a journey. We should always want Bitcoin to become more decentralized, and we should always be diligent and vigilant in that regard.
There is a question from the audience that I think is interesting, which is, can you describe in more depth how the governance works in the decentralized ShapeShift? Because I think it's one of the few things out there that's really got some history. And yeah, so what does that look like? How do you have those little buckets that then, and how do they take in their votes? And
yeah, so like a simple mental model here is that several hundred years ago, the private corporation was invented, right? Like I think in Amsterdam or something. And ever after that, that model of having like a single centralized entity where investors could pool resources and it had some kind of shared liability within that entity was highly successful and grew. And there are obviously corporations all over the world now. A DAO, decentralized autonomous organization, is like a new form of organization. It's not a company, but it is an organization, and it's something different. The way they generally work is instead of in a corporation where you have an entity and you have shareholders that govern or that declare the board selects a CEO and the CEO builds everything in the company. In a DAO, there's no entity at all. And if you've registered your DAO in Wyoming, then it's not a DAO. In a DAO,
here from Wyoming, but
I know they're always like, oh, well, we have a DAO law.
Yeah.
In a DAO, all the power rests with the token holders. So if you have 1,000 tokens and 1,000 people each have one token, obviously that is a perfect egalitarian power structure. But those tokens will move around, right? Someone will buy more, someone will sell them. And the tokens are what establish the power and rights over the software. How they do that depends a lot on how the project has set things up. The way that ShapeShift did it was that we basically said all that really matters in an economic organization is like who controls the money. So we created a multi-sig treasury using Gnosis Safe, if any of you guys are aware of that project. And to move money out, this is all crypto money, of course, we would never use fiat or other disgusting instruments. To move money out of that treasury requires a preponderance of the voters, of the token voters. So that simple rule then allows everything else to kind of form, right? So someone can come to the DAO and say, hey, I would like to do marketing for you guys for the next 3 months. I want $200,000 to do it. Here's my credentials. And if the community of token holders believes this person, they can all vote to let $200,000 worth of Bitcoin or ETH leave the contract and go pay that person. And from that, you can really create an organization of almost any kind through that basic structure.
How many voting members? And of course, it's moving around all the time, but is there a kind of a range of token holders that vote? And some are going to be active, some not active, but what's the size of the community that had to manage itself?
The really interesting aspect of these things is how transparent they are. So I know that us in the crypto world are often derided as like shadowy supercoders by the Elizabeth Warrens of the world, and we're always shown wearing the like Guy Fawkes mask as these like radical anarchists that don't want anyone to know about anything. In reality, we've actually built like the most transparent technology for finance and governance that's ever existed. And this fact, I think, is surprisingly lost on people. Any normal corporation, you have no idea what's going on in the boardroom, right, if you're an outsider. You don't know who owns the shares, and you don't know how they're voting and how all that stuff happens. In a DAO, it's all on chain. So right now, like there's roughly 23,000 holders of the Fox token. And you can see which of those wallets are voting on specific actions that the DAO would do. So it really inverts everything. It makes everything open and transparent. And for that reason, for some projects, that's not appropriate. Like not every project in the world should be a DAO. Some projects need secrecy and privacy. But to the degree that, that you don't, especially if you're like an open source software project, this is a great model.
And going back to the communications element of that, had you done it before and communicated earlier, how does that happen now? Because I think about like elections, totally different thing, but here we are in this democracy in America, and small vocal parties dominate all the discussion. And does that happen in the ShapeShift DAO?
I would be remiss if I didn't immediately point out the difference between like government democracy and a DAO, right? Government
Please
democracy is based on force. If you do not comply, you'll be thrown in jail or you'll be killed. This is basically what underlines various governments. That's a very uncivilized, inhumane way to structure an organization. A DAO, of course, is all voluntary. Everyone who's involved owns the tokens because they want it. There's ability to exit whenever you wish. So there's no coercion whatsoever. And that creates, obviously, a much more civilized and I would say humane governance structure. But in terms of communication, we use all the normal crypto tools that people are familiar with, Discord channels and Telegram channels and that kind of thing. And then the actual voting is done through on-chain smart contracts like Snapshot.
Interesting. Okay, great. And I think we're going to end the day later with a discussion on new technology trends. But I'm curious, you've worked on some really pioneering things, and what's coming up? Where do you see other pieces of technology kind of in front of us that maybe touch or not touch the blockchain, and what kind of things are you working on now?
Yeah, well, so I've started working on a crypto AI project, and it's called Morpheus. I haven't been super public about that yet. But basically, I see AI speeding toward many of the same issues that the cryptocurrency faced, which is incredibly powerful technology that will be co-opted by centralized intermediaries and or the governments that oversee them, unless alternatives exist, right? And so Bitcoin was that first alternative where you could have permissionless finance without any intermediary. And money is extremely powerful, and it's very important that no single authority in the world has all power over all money. Like, that would be very dystopian. The same is true with AI. AI is incredibly powerful, and if the vast majority of power over AI comes down to several tech companies and the government that oversees them in a certain jurisdiction, that can get very dystopian. And so I got interested in it because I think it's important that people can access open source permissionless AI. This is a very controversial statement. Most people, when you poll them, think AI should be regulated by various governments. Of course, that's their answer to everything. And when the regulations don't really turn out very well, they just say, maybe we need to vote harder next time and get different people in there. But I think actually the solution to this stuff is open source software. And Bitcoin has been the most beautiful demonstration of how completely voluntary you can take an institution as important as money and let anyone in the world, regardless of who they are or where they live, access it. And so I want to do something similar with AI if I can help.
So did I get the phrase open source permissionless AI?
Yeah.
And so I don't know how much more you can describe about, or if you want to describe because it's so early, but to the extent that you can describe kind of what does that look like, and how can people here, or what kind of companies or groups could help you?
So everyone is familiar with ChatGPT at this point, right? Amazing tool, amazing company. When you send a text into ChatGPT, you have a question or something. First of all, the entire text that you just wrote goes to OpenAI. Mm-hmm. So they know what you wrote. For many things that might not matter, but for other things it does. You have no privacy there. Second, they will then send you a response back, and that response is guardrailed in many ways. Some of them benign, some of them reasonable, some of them very patronizing. And I think all of you who have used that software over the last year have realized that more and more answers come back treating you like a child. And as a self-respecting adult, I don't want to be beholden to that. So the concept within Morpheus is simply that instead of closed source LLM, large language model from OpenAI, you instead use open source large language models, of which there are many. A dozen big companies around the world are putting out really good open source LLMs, including Facebook, amazingly. And you allow people to access those LLMs through decentralized channels, which means that the provider, the compute provider who's doing the processing of the answer, does not come from any centralized company, but comes from one of many different nodes on the network. So when you have an open source LLM and you have a decentralized set of providers of the compute, you create a permissionless alternative to a ChatGPT. And I would always love the ChatGPTs of the world to exist. Obviously, pioneers, like I have huge respect for what they've built. But I think humanity needs open source alternatives, and so the time to build that stuff is now.
So, and you, yeah, I'm looking at this space too. You know, and I see obviously there are some open source things. I think is it PyTorch or Llama?
Llama is one, yeah.
Yeah, Llama. Okay, so I'd love your kind of picture of what's the landscape look like of open source LLMs that have a shot of actually becoming significant.
Yeah, so there's a bunch, and it's very hard to keep up with this stuff.
Yeah.
So Llama is not actually an LLM. It's like a distribution platform for open source large language models.
Okay.
So anyone who's interested in this stuff, Llama is a great place to get started because you can browse in a standardized way all the various LLMs that are out there. But a new one comes out like every few weeks, right? So I already mentioned Facebook. They have one of the biggest ones.
Theirs is called what? Do you remember if
Llama 2, right?
Llama 2, okay.
Llama 2.
Llama, okay.
I don't know if that's a coincidence with Ollama, but it's all very terribly confusing. There's a French company named Mistral,
yes,
which I think many people have heard of. They're putting out some of the best open source LLMs. And of course, they've had this whole regulatory fight now in the EU because the EU wants to regulate this stuff. And so you have like France, who finally has this big tech company, you know, a private unicorn, finally getting large, and the EU is about to regulate them out of existence if they're not careful. So yeah, there's several. I don't want to go through like too long of a list here, but a year or two ago, there were not competitive open source LLMs.
Yeah.
At the rate at which they are being released and improving, they are approaching the best closed source LLMs. So that's what really makes it work, right? Like no one wants to use a decentralized AI if it sucks. It has to be, you know, roughly as good as the answers as the centralized one. And if it also doesn't spy on you or censor the answers, you know, I think that's a compelling value prop.
Yeah. Do you look at stuff in silicon too? You know, because obviously, like, I know you're not a silicon guy, but NVIDIA has such a lock on the market, and you know, AMD, which was able to topple Intel in some ways, and kind of the CPU thing, they're going after NVIDIA GPUs, and that maybe not your space, but I think Facebook and Microsoft are working to take open source stuff so that runs on AMD to maybe decentralize a little bit the silicon layer. Do you ever look at silicon stuff? Or?
Yeah, I'm not an engineer, unfortunately, and so I don't understand anything about the hardware chip world. It's obviously very, very cool and fast growing, and NVIDIA has an amazing, I won't call it it's not a real monopoly, but it's close to that.
Yeah.
So I know everyone's like gunning for their heels, and there's a huge chip shortage all over the world, so yeah, it's a big problem.
Yeah, and to put some numbers on that, for you guys that watch the market, okay, so AMD was one of the like very, very early silicon companies that really hit, along with, you know, Intel, National, AMD, you know, all these companies. And NVIDIA in sequential quarters grew about $5 billion in revenue in one quarter. And AMD, after AMD started, I think, like in the late 70s, their revenue per quarter is a little over $5 billion. So in 1 3-month period, NVIDIA added the entire size of an AMD in 3 months, that's mind-blowing. It took, you know, 30 or 40 years to get to that size, and it's mind-blowing. So I don't know what's going to happen next, but there's so much momentum behind NVIDIA now that
the scale of this stuff is really intimidating, I would say.
Yeah, and when you look at running LLM, I don't know if are you running LLMs are you actually paying for compute time at different places yet, or?
Yeah.
You are, okay.
So there's a decentralized compute provider called Akash. Akash, A-K-A-S-H.
Okay.
It's like a crypto native project built on a IBC Cosmos chain that basically gives you permissionless access to GPUs on demand, all crypto native. And so that's one of the projects that Morpheus is working with, and they're kind of springing up all over the place.
So, and are those GPUs that people have been using for mining, or are they dedicated?
Those are basically, it's like two-sided marketplace. So customers come there if they want to buy GPU time you know, for a week or a month, and then people with GPUs, ranging from some guy with a 1080 in his basement to someone with a huge server farm, can put up that compute and that marketplace. So it's basically just a decentralized marketplace that matches providers of compute with consumers.
Interesting. Yeah, because I don't know if anyone in this room has been out trying to buy GPUs, but I have been. And to buy 4 GPUs is like $280,000 now.
Which GPUs?
The NVIDIA H100s.
Yeah, so those are like the main ones used in AI training, and they're just nearly impossible to get.
It's crazy, like $45,000 or $48,000, whatever. It's like $48,000 a card, which is.
Yeah, well, there's like a very predictable problem here, which is that AI and software, because AI is software, can grow at the rate of software, which is nearly exponentially. Like the speed with which OpenAI gained 100 million customers is exponential. Chip fab can grow, only at a linear or slightly exponential pace, and so it's very predictable to see that like when the demand for the software side increases exponentially, even if every fab in the world is trying to do what they can to grow, it can never match that curve. So this is probably a problem that won't get resolved in the next couple of years either.
Have you looked at all at or been reading about the New York Times lawsuit with, the copyright
just
stuff?
the headlines. They're suing OpenAI for training on their articles.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in the open source world, I don't know if you've thought about that, but like if people are putting their content into out there that then gets used for training models, and then the incremental user wants to create something and it sucks out of that. Does that have implications for what you want to do?
Well, if a project's decentralized, it can't be sued.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah.
So part of making decentralized open source AI work is that it has to be able to resist any subpoena.
Yeah.
And I don't think most people have seen this coming yet, but certainly within a year or two, the regulations on what people can do with AI are going to become very severe. And so certainly I know people agree with all those regulations that are coming, but for those of us who believe that like information is power, just as money is power, and because it's powerful, it can be dangerous, and because it's dangerous, you need to like not centralize that power in a single focal point. For people who believe that, the impetus to have decentralized AI, I think, is huge.
To pull together the capital, so you've been through every type of fundraising thing, So I guess the Bitcoin Dice, was that your first company, first real company?
Satoshi Dice.
Satoshi Dice.
That was never even an entity, actually. That was a little software project that kind of got out of hand.
Oh, and so you didn't raise money for that?
No.
Interesting. It just got profitable.
Yeah, well, it's a casino, right? They're pretty profitable. Although it was
yeah.
It was scary though, because
50% of the world's Bitcoin transactions, how can you not be profitable anyway?
Yeah, well, it wasn't profitable every day, so there were like days and weeks of severe losses, and I would always wonder if someone figured out an exploit. So it was like extremely stressful. I had some sympathy for any casino operator. Like yes, they rake in money, but they have to be very careful about what's going on in their casino. And I had to do the same with Satoshi Dice.
And ShapeShift, did you raise equity capital for that, or?
Yep. So yeah, that started as a normal VC startup. I funded the early year, and then did a seed round, and we went up to a Series A with some German VCs, Early Bird and Lakestar, who were fantastic partners. Yep. So we did that whole thing, and to their credit, years later, when we wanted to decentralize, that's not something a VC really knows about. Yeah. And we couldn't have done it if we didn't give them a good return, right? Yeah. We're not just going to decentralize and be like, oh, sorry guys, can't sue us. Yep. So we paid out everyone a multiple on what they invested, and because the company. And
how did you decide? How did that get negotiated?
I think by then our investors trusted us, and we talked to them if they wanted to talk about it. But honestly, like it was so frontier and weird that a lot of them were just like, Erik, we'll go for it. We'll see how that works. But they got liquidity on something that they had invested in years earlier, so they were all happy about that. And then they retained upside on the Fox token itself, so it worked pretty smoothly for everyone. But if we hadn't been profitable, it would have been very difficult to do that, because we wouldn't have had money to pay back everyone on a multiple. And
given all the alternatives out there now in this new world and old, how do you look at how you will capitalize your next project?
I am so burned out from working within the normal system of entities and regulations that I just won't do it. I just won't ever do it again.
you won't ever raise money outside again, or you won't.
Nothing through a bank, nothing through like a normal corporate entity. I just never would do it again.
Yeah.
And for those of you who have read Atlas Shrugged, and you know the scene where Wyatt like blows up his mine or his oil well, and it catches on fire. There's just like this beautiful moment where he refuses to participate with all the looters that are trying to rob him. And I've been through that world, and I refuse to do it again. So I don't think I can ever stop like building projects, but I love how crypto works. I love how decentralized permissionless systems work. So everything I do is going to use cryptocurrency, be permissionless, no entity, no jurisdiction. Like it's open source from the ground up. That's what I care about now.
Fascinating. Well, pioneer on so many fronts, and for me as a career venture capitalist, it's to see these trends and project like that. That's kind of interesting, because I think what is the role of a venture capitalist in a world like that?
Well, and VCs, the best VCs for years now have been comfortable investing for tokens of a project, and indeed tokens, as long as the project is legitimate, tokens are amazing. You get liquidity far more early. You can stay around, and you can buy more easily. Like tokens can be fantastic, but it requires VCs to update their models a bit. And sometimes they can't even invest in an entity. They just have to have contracts with developers. And so it's new. But like a VC should be on the forefront of financing, right?
You'd think so.
They are the ones who should be financing the frontier.
You'd think so.
Yeah.
And on that note, I think we are out of time. So follow us out into the lounge for bubble Q&A. So thank you all for coming.
Thanks, Bill.
Thank you, Erik. That was awesome.
Thank you.